As you know, there is a change because instead of Mr. Marvin Lyle, we've got with us today Dean Johnson. So let's start.
Firstly, thank you all for being here still, as it's this late. I've nearly had the graveyard shift, but I'm actually one before that, which is very good. So there's many more of you here than I expected. A slight change of tack, I guess, for a conference focused on the kind of the being startups. Now, something that we do at Brownwith, we create amazing digital experiences. Now, what does that mean? That sounds quite vague, but actually, what I aim to do today is show you what that means and how that relates to the business and businesses that are hoping to start up. Because the way we treat each of those projects, they sit in their own little capsule. Mostly they involve any number of ways that you would have to tell your audience about a new business or a brand new product, because they kind of stand alone as that. Some of them are parts of series, but we won't touch on that. So what you see behind me here is there's a collection of what we do. The kind of the amazing products, but the best way to illustrate that is kind of with my moving wall of apps and iBooks and incredible products, because these broach all sorts from entertainment, and the entertainment business comes from movies and music, and then we kind of go across things like automotive and leisure. Now those, you think about those products, some of those sail well below the radar. Some of them provide all the wonders of the infrastructure and the ability for you guys to communicate. Walk into an automotive dealership and you find something that's actually talking to a database that's assessing the value of your car, that's helping you choose, select, configure the car that you want to buy. All of those things sit well below the radar. But the fun stuff that I want to talk about today are the bits, the kind of the headline projects that are much more easily related to essentially the different types of characters within startups. So you look at behind me here, we've got things from the Guinness World Records through to amazing children's books and incredible content that comes to life on those digital platforms that we now have at our disposal. But it comes down to the point of how do we relate this to startups and what you should and shouldn't do. So particularly for apps, some of these will be a lot more focused on the fact that a regular launch of an app or an iBook or a multi-touch product that will sit across your mobile devices. So much more, it's easier to talk about what you shouldn't do than what you should, because the things that we should do are very much things that's kind of bread and butter. That's how you launch something. But these are the things that you shouldn't. So consider, at launch, prior to launch, you have your expectations set very, very high. Now, I don't want you to set your expectations very, very low, but there's a healthy compromise to be met somewhere in the middle there, and it's a case of, this market is fresh to you. You're likely to hit a market that one doesn't know about you, so there's lots of things that you need to prime that for. But two, you cannot expect, no matter how many boxes you tick, you cannot just expect a massive sales success. And sales can come in different ways, and how you gauge that as success can be something, how the actual numbers of downloads, the actual eyeballs on a device, and the actual interactivity with that, before we even get to the point of sale and how you are monetizing that product. So be realistic about those views. By all means, help generate and drive your team forward and give it some enthusiastic, genuine enthusiastic input into the product itself. However, you've got to know that this is a long-term game. So a part of this, when we approach an app, for example, we'll be given, essentially, as we would call it, a bag of bits. That could be some disconnected assets. That could be something that is, that could start as a gem of an idea. But a big chunk of that, at least 50% of what we do, is pulling all of that together. So for instance, we'll work with clients whose business may not be set up to actually work in that way or for that particular platform. And that could be the same approach, your product, your project, your baby that you want to launch and unleash on the world could be something that is completely incompatible until you join all the dots with the audience that you're trying to talk to. So yeah, a big chunk of that is just to say, look, the glamour and the arm waving and the fun stuff that comes out of this at the end. There's a lot of that happens underneath the surface, and you need to make sure that that is lined up, particularly when you have, and I'll show you in a minute, some of the bigger projects that genuinely, you know, they're scattered to the wind, this kind of content, and one of the great challenges is to bring that together so that it feels as a whole. So don't rush to market. Now, for the, you know, potentially you have one really good shot at launching an app, for example. Now, there will be other instances where you can genuinely have a soft launch, and you can use beta testing, and you can get something out there to test the audience. However, when it comes to advertising, when it comes to promotion, when it comes to all the things and all of those channels that you need to pull together to let your potential audience know that your product exists, you may have one shot at that. So don't rush to market with something that gets seen in not necessarily incomplete state, because again, I'll touch on it in a second. You don't need to have everything in there, but what is there needs to be the real heart and soul of your product. So this is the best example of saying, well, don't overdevelop. So for instance, you think about some of the most successful products, successful apps, they have a single focus. They are not trying to supply you with absolutely everything. And good examples of that now are the way that the more of the social apps that were beginning to give you lots of different options, they're now splitting them out as separate apps, for good or bad in some instances. Sometimes it does help to have a conversation and a message board and a way to talk to people in one place. So you don't necessarily want to take too much out, but at the same time you don't want to put too much in. You know, too much content is just going to confuse and leave your audience with a bad user experience and a bad journey through that product. Now, that audience, the guys that are the ones having the good or the bad experience, they're the ones that need to give you that feedback. So, you know, as we mentioned, you could potentially have a soft launch. But actually more important than that, it's not about taking everyone's advice. It's about user testing within your company, user testing within your wider circles, and potentially opening that up to a broader audience that you take into the fold. You make them feel as if they're part of this, particularly if you're talking about something social. For example, you know, you think you may have the best idea in the world for a new social app, but that means nothing if there's no one in it to be social. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that the people that get involved with that project from the outset are giving you feedback about how they want to talk to each other. But of course, when you launch that, you want to make sure that they're already in there, so that the first person that rolls up to your new social app that wants to compete with Facebook, they see that there are already some people in there to actually interact with. Now, don't fire and forget. So this is one of the cardinal sins and one of the unchecked boxes that you'll find when a product is launched. It's the fact that you forget to, and you've been swept up in that excitement of the launch itself, and you've worked your way all the way up to this amazing product that you then think, well, you unleash it on the world. Of course, in this amazing digital searchable world, everyone will just come and download it. Wrong. You need to make sure that you're having the conversations with the right people. This comes down to platform ownership, so it could be the App Store, it could be Google Play, but of course it can be those various touch points where you should be for someone to just download something. Now, print adverts, having something as cardboard standee, that kind of doesn't work for the app market. You know, we've had products that have been in Apple's physical app stores on every single device, and that's very good for us, and that sounds amazing until you realize that someone goes into an Apple store and plays with something on an iPad, and then when they get home, they forgot what they've already played with in the store. So you need to have that kind of point of immediacy where someone can go, I get it, oh, I like that, it's a single tap through to actually download or purchase your product. So don't believe the hype. So be wary of the soft launch. So we kind of talked about the fact that you can unleash something without all of without all of that surrounding it. So yes, if you build it, they will come. Is a great title for Kevin Costner and a movie, and that's a brilliant concept. However, it's still not going to work if you haven't got that top level of advertising. But that's even more relevant. So the whole point of saying, once you've got it out there in the world, you may well get 1 week's worth of promotion on the App Store. That's amazing for downloads, but that's an enormous peak, which is followed very briefly by a sliding scale and then a massive continuous trough. You need to be able to say that actually beyond the advertising, it's about conversation. So consider your social networks, consider all the channels that you have at your disposal that you do not have at your disposal through the stores. The people that give you 1 star and a very poor rating because they downloaded it to the wrong device, or they say it just doesn't work and they haven't switched something off and on again. One of the great examples was TouchPress produced a great app that was about X-rays. So for example, you could spin and view and see things in their X-rayed state. And one of the comments on the App Store was, well, I downloaded this and I've tried it with my iPad and I can't X-ray anything. That's amazing. Clearly your iPad is not going to be turned into an X-ray machine. However, there's no right of reply there, and they've given it 1 star. So that kind of drops the ratings. But if you have the social channels open to you, you're in a position to start to move that conversation on. And it's knowing that there is someone, a human, on the other end of this process, that not only opens it up to the audience to have them drawn in so that you can tell them about updates, you can tell them about advances in your product, and they can begin to tell other people. But also they feel as if there's someone there, someone that genuinely cares. Now, this also goes for the products itself. So, that's about conversation. But think about how it exists and how it lives on beyond that initial launch. So, for example, that could be a new software update simply because of the operating system. But actually, you should have a longer-term plan than that. Think about how this thing is going to live and breathe and evolve beyond your initial product. That product you'd have had all of that focus on the thing that launches. But the thing that continues to live 6, 12 months down the line is genuinely essential to know that it's got somewhere to go, it's got somewhere to live. If your exit strategy is to sell it within 6 to 12 months, then whoever's going to buy into this may well have plans for themselves. However, to think about how it's going to live on is key to this, because again, it comes across to your audience. You're not only in communication with them, but you're also, in collaboration with them. So they have an opportunity to feedback. They have an opportunity to, some of that criticism that does appear on the App Store is very constructive. So it gives you a great way to know how that could shift and move. And then finally, think about how the thing looks. It's like having the spines of your books on the bookshelf. The ugly ones and the battered ones, they don't always stay up on display. To be fair, a lot of the ones that stay on people's bookshelves now haven't even been read. They're there to make you look good. Some of that can actually be associated with apps. But it's because we have this tiny piece of real estate, this thing that sits in our pockets, and the first screen, maybe the second screen, if you're lucky, the third screen, they have the apps, our primary focus. They sit on the desktop. Now, some actually are vital enough to keep, but the majority of the time you still want to know that that beautiful device that you get out of your pocket has still got beautiful icons on it. The example would be, I guess, if you had an ugly child, well, it's probably maybe not an ugly child, maybe an ugly niece or nephew, you wouldn't put their photo on your phone. Some of you might, I wouldn't. But you would want to keep the good-looking kids on there, so that'd be fine. Or maybe your wife. But this is genuinely essential, because it's something that that becomes your brand. That becomes the one tiny piece of real estate, and it's the same if you're choosing music. That real estate has got smaller and smaller and smaller, from LPs down to icons, from the covers of DVDs down to icons, and the same for books. So there's some key points there to thinking about how you launch a product, particularly into the app market. But what probably serves us best here is to give you some examples of how we've done this. So I'm going to give you a broad spectrum of some of our products here and try and associate some kind of character and personality to them as if they were the go-getter, as if they were the pioneer, and the whatever character it could be within the startup market. So if I can talk over some of the videos that will play in the background here. So this was Led Zeppelin Sound and Fury. It was an iBook, which is a multi-touch book for Apple. And I called this the Pioneer simply because it was a case of it was the first multi-touch book to include streamed music. And they were streamed previews. So you've got the full history of the band. You've got Neil Preston, who was their official photographer, essentially was the extra member of the band, traveling around with them. Great way to have something that it was essentially a big coffee table book. Amazing photography. And you end up with something that has added video, has added audio, and Neil's stories behind each of these amazing photos. But of course, the thing that really enriches that is when you've got the music as well. So, this wasn't rocket science. This was a case of taking the iTunes previews, dropping those in so that they became a seamless part of the book. And that's the beautiful thing about the music business is the music. But you've got that in abundance to actually sit along with the rest of this content. So it was a first, but a very simple first. And then, in a similar vein, but this time an app. So this was the app for the Doors. Very, very different. So we talk about a leader here, and this was because we worked with Jack Holtzman, who originally signed and discovered the Doors. An absolute pioneer in his day, and it's still his day. This guy's 80, and he's been through everything. He co-founded Atari. He put in the first video conferencing in the world. He pioneered music, and it's kind of has been part of that business as it's always gone on. So he came to us and said, look, I have all of this stuff for the Doors. I've told the story in many different ways throughout the years, from books to radio interviews to TV, to the films. What I really want to do is have something with no barriers, no restrictions. And I do want to tell the story, but I want to tell it on my terms. So Jack, being the kind of force of nature that he is, he wanted to kind of bend everything to his will in this. So it was a case of genuinely leading with something that gave you access to all of the individual albums, but in a way that made you, suddenly have a whole raft of extra content and so much depth to it. Whether that was through amazing kind of graphic novels, the original, you could thumb through the original FBI case files, lots and lots of content, but about genuinely leading rather than following or abiding by the rules in this case. And then something like Save Mr. Banks, and now this was another multi-touch book, but it was, and as I say, we've called this one The Preacher. So, if you launch a product out into the world, that doesn't necessarily need to be your end game. That doesn't need to be your hero piece, your hero app. In this case, it was about saying, look, how can we take marketing? How can we use some great content, create something new, but use it as a marketing piece that sits on a platform? So Save Mr. Banks was about telling the story of the making of the film, and it was very much about very rich musical offering again, because it kind of gave all the original lyrics and sheet music and pieces of music embedded again. But it became a product in itself, a free product, so it was available to a much wider audience, but had some retained value because it's a beautifully made product. Now, the Rebel. Now, this was for Demi Lovato and Hollywood Records. It was about taking something. Now, I say Rebel here because the whole point of the project was to blow the doors off the iBook store, which sounds great, and it sounds like an interesting concept until you realise that the audience that we were trying to sell this to didn't read books. They didn't know what an iBook was, and they didn't own iPads. It wasn't the ideal place to start from. We essentially had the worst possible outlay. If we were ticking boxes, none of those boxes were ticked. But we were playing to an audience that was voracious for the kind of content. So they would buy a single to help their artist, to get their artist to #1. This actually happened in much the same way with an iBook, and it was about talking to an audience that really just wanted to collect and own and be a part of all sorts of things. Just despite the fact that they wouldn't read it, they would still experience it. So that's about being rebellious with your product and putting something out there when the rules are there to be kind of trampled all over. Now, as far as an expert's concerned, sometimes you'll be faced with content. So this is the Doctor Who encyclopedia. Amazing projects, because we get faced with lots and lots of apps that would make brilliant reference pieces. But that tends to be non-fiction, even if you're talking about something fictional. But in this case, the whole thing remained fictional, because this was written and produced as if Doctor Who was real. He is, of course. But this was about taking something that didn't remove you from the experience. It wasn't about behind the scenes. It was about, you know, if Doctor Who had his own iPad, how would he use it as a reference piece? So a fabulous way to do that, and a great way to get over expert opinion, but beautifully dressed up in something that makes it feel as if you're still part of the experience. And then mold breaker. So this was about breaking a mold that had well and truly been set. And with Journey to the Exoplanets, there was another TouchPress app that was already in existence, that a client had come to us and said, could we have one of those? And we said, well, you could have one of those, but it would basically be the same thing again. Let's try and break out of that. They said, well, we want spinning planets. We said, well, you can have spinning planets. But the point here was to say that we gave them something for a reason. So essentially we built what we called the planet builder. So you had this planet that you could spin, which was great. We kind of ticked that box. Then we had a series of sliders down the side that changed that planet in relation to how far it was from a star, what it was made up from, and before your eyes that visually transformed. But actually what it did from an educational point of view, it told you the result of that. So could it sustain life? What was it like? What was the actual planet surface like? So there were 3 levels there. There was the real playability at that top level. There was something that you could actually see and have an effect on, and then you could actually read and understand what that effect actually was. So it was about breaking a mold that had already been set, and that was very much, you know, you inevitably launch products that, you know, others have gone before you. You can't always expect to be the first, but you can damn well try and be the best, and that's, you know, that's certainly something we stand by. And then the box ticker. So we produced the Star Wars Scene Maker with Disney and Lucasfilm. Amazing project for a business full of people that all love Star Wars. That's no bad thing. But the great thing here was that we essentially started off the project with, again, it was the overview was that it could be an amazing immersive reference piece. What we ended up with, as you can see here, is just something so different, so far removed from that, where now you can put yourself in George Lucas's or J.J. Abrams' shoes, and you can recreate the iconic scenes of Star Wars. A great piece of storytelling, because you can genuinely, you can try and produce that again, or, and this is where the fun starts, you can actually try and create your own versions of that. Who wouldn't want Darth Vader saying to an Ewok, "I am your father"? There's great opportunities there, and then, but the piece at the end of it is that you can then share that across networks. So, that not only allows everyone else to have fun with it, but of course it gets you. It allows the user to tell everyone else how much fun they've had. And this was a great thing that came out of the focus groups at the start, was that we produced something here that felt to us as if it could have been far too deep, far too immersive, and actually quite complicated. We gave it to a bunch of kids and they all just immediately got it. It made us feel quite old. It made us feel as if we didn't understand the things we were actually working with, but it completely proved the point that this was the perfect age group. And what's happened from that now is that we've been able to refine that. We've been able to work with the controls, the actual process and the medium of it, and end up with something that is going to live on and on and on, because essentially we're launching scenes every other month, and you may have heard that there's another big film coming out next year. Well, we'll be launching all the way up to and through that, and the real challenge is that you want to keep this kind of thing alive, and you want to with the classic films, that are all the way up to the new films, you want to know that everyone feels that that's iconic. But the new films, they obviously want to play with that on a whole new scale. And then there's the DIY. So this is very much about this. You know, this from our perspective is our own startup. You know, when we talk about these in isolation as potentially startup projects, this is very much the case with something like Fish, or however you want to pronounce it. This was one of our own titles, and it was a case of everything was produced in-house, from the illustration to, obviously we develop everything in-house anyway, but it was the full thing. So the whole book was written, narrated, the music created in-house, and we wanted to do something with the children's book market that, you know, we weren't aiming to set the entire world on fire by making sure it got into everyone's hands. It was very much a case of, you know, as we do with a lot of the innovation work that we do, we wanted to try lots of interesting firsts. So, you know, you turn the iPad and the sea levels move. You can, a child kind of takes their own photo at the start and they puts in their own name, and then they become part of the story, but only at key points. So, for instance, a submarine appears at the end and their little face is kind of peeking out the porthole. Real fun stuff to do. You use the camera to actually turn a mirror, or actually produce a mirror on screen, and you shout at the app itself. You know, you shout a tissue at the app, and that responds and changes things within the story. So these were lots of markers in the sand, again about launching. You know, you don't always have to make sure that your first product is the big launch. That first product could be that marker in the sand to say that we were there first, we were setting stones here. So the final one I've got here actually is interesting because it's still kind of a startup for us. It's the Luminous Place, and this was about we were approached by Mark Stauffer, who was formerly head of production at Universal Studios in London. He then moved to LA and decided to become a screenwriter, became a successful screenwriter. He then wrote his first novel, but he kind of didn't settle for that. He said he didn't really just want to write a novel. He wanted this to be interactive, immersive, so that there was a genuine depth to this. So he approached us, having seen the kind of stuff that we'd already produced, and said, what can I do with this? You know, initially it was about, there was just too much. There was way too much happening there. But the challenge was in taking something that was a genuine reading experience and adding the right level of interaction to it, so that it became something that was, you know, the interaction is recessive, it's not excessive. It's about taking something that just punctuates that content at key points and doesn't sit over the top, doesn't disrupt it. So where we built an initial prototype, but the next step was to take this to Kickstarter. So this would then give us the boost that we needed for further development to take this to a platform that was, you know, much closer to that product. The Kickstarter campaign was successful, $75,000. Bizarrely also contributed to by Russell Crowe. And we were talking this morning about the celebrity investors. They're still out there. They're still out there. They still make headlines, and it still kind of works. But it's a case of we have something that now sits there in our own little startup bubble, because we have our own product that's kind of waiting for that next step. And the reason we haven't taken the next step is because it's about educating the audience. And this comes back to all of those products that I've talked about. You can't just fire and forget. You can't just launch something, do that soft launch and hope that people find it. But more importantly than any of those things, your audience needs to understand your product. So Luminous Place, as an example, you know, we know the audience out there quite happily reads fiction on a Kindle or a paperback. Now, what they don't happily do, and then what they don't actively do, rather, is sit there and think, oh, I wish this all moved. I wish someone else read it to me and showed me pictures and video and everything else. So it's a step you need to take, is to educate your audience as to why there's a genuine benefit. Why, if they download your product, is their life going to be changed? Now, on the magnitude, that doesn't mean that their life is going to be changed beyond all vision. It can be just those very simple things that makes their life easier, that gives them extra time, frees up time to do something else. But this is an example that says very much about, if I'm going to have some immersive storytelling, if I'm going to take things another step, tell me why. Don't just tell me it's available. Don't tell me where it is. Don't tell me how much it costs. I need to know all of those things. But primarily, why do I want to download this? And why do I want to keep it? So Luminous Place is our own kind of startup. And that, in a nutshell, is the 10 essential things that you guys need to know for launching apps, iBooks, interactive products, but more importantly, they're rules that can genuinely be applied to any number of situations within the startup community. And then there's a whole bunch of examples of how we've done things. And I'd like to say that we've happily failed and succeeded within that lot. And say happily, that the happy failings have not always been at our expense, but what we've learned from that is the ability to tell people what they should do next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Questions.
No. Okay. So one more time. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure.